Welcome, folks. I know it's been so long since we've done one of these. It's been like 22 hours. So you're just so tired of my face. So we have a repeat guest today to talk about protest security and emergency medical safety. You may know her as the woke scientist on Instagram and now found on Substack, Dr. Ayesha Khan. So thanks for coming back.
Thanks.
Was that a good intro?
Repeat guest sounds so cozy.
I know, right? We're
I
like
like.
old friends now. So, how are you doing? I know it's a lot warmer where you are than I am, and I'm freezing, and I have a bunch of chickens like squawking behind this wall over here. So it's just,
Wait, are those the little chicks that they all posted, like the
yep,
little baby chicks? Oh,
yep.
so.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of those, and my cats are just angrily like pacing near them. It's a fun time. So for folks that are watching on my Instagram live stream off my phone, I'm about to cut off. So if you guys want to join us, twitch.tv/Poor Proles Almanac, or you can hop on Facebook or YouTube to watch it over there. See you guys another time. All right, that is done. So
It's impressive how you juggle all these like different platforms at the same time. It's so
I'm
smart.
terrible at it. Like this is the extent of my social media skills, is like doing this. I didn't really use social media until like we started the podcast, and my wife's like, "Do you know what a meme is?" And I was like, "I think so. It's the pictures, right?" And then she got mad at me that I'm better at it than her. And yeah, so that's a whole long story. So welcome everyone. If you are not familiar with the Poor Proles Almanac and you're wondering why you're watching this, we are a podcast that focuses on building skills, building dual power, thinking about what the future looks like and how do we prepare for that future today. On the Twitch channel or wherever you're watching this, we focus primarily on this concept of skill sharing, talking to people that have skills that we don't, and just basically trying to give people the basic foundational knowledge that they can use to know what they don't know and start making steps towards being more resilient, building better communities, all of that important stuff. And Dr. Khan has been with us a few times to chat about various subject matters, usually about like intrapersonal stuff mostly. So this is a little bit outside of what we've done in the past. So let's talk about protest security.
Okay, so I guess I wanted to kind of do a broader, bigger picture overview of security culture. And I think just because these are words that weren't familiar to me until I got into grassroots activism, like I didn't understand what any of this was. So for folks that are new to the whole like world of organizing, a lot of this applies if you are in community already. And I think that's something I highly recommend, finding other community members to organize with. So other organizations or groups that already exist that are able to give you some sort of a starting point, because it's always easier to start with other people rather than just figure it out on your own.
Yeah, and before you keep going, I do want to say this is something I see quite a bit, and I'm sure you do too. It's like people are like, I want to start an organization because there's nothing here, and there is things there. They just don't know about it. So like seriously, like if you're interested in like organizing, reach out to people in various communities, whether it's left gun organizations or food not bombs or things like that. You are going to find somebody in your area. I almost guarantee you it exists already. So tap into that infrastructure before you kind of go down this road.
Yeah, and I guess it'll become really obvious soon why it's easier to learn from existing organizations that have built some sort of infrastructure, and there's directories, and for example, if you're involved in academia or are an undergrad or in any college campus of any kind, that's a really easy starting point for joining already well-established activism groups that are doing work. And then in communities, there's a lot of like databases essentially of groups and what they do. So I think it helps to start somewhere, even if it's not perfect. And I think part of learning is just doing, and then you kind of see what works and what doesn't work, and then find other groups or organizations that might be a better fit. But security culture in general is essentially the ways and strategies that groups and grassroots organizers take in in order to be I guess efficient and smart in how you organize, being aware of threats that are already existent, like the state, and being very proactive in making sure your organizing isn't just reactionary, but it's set up in a manner that you know and you understand the systems that you work under, and you're aware of not just the systems that you're working against, but also the power that you have and how you can leverage that power efficiently, I guess. And I say efficiently because each individual member of any group or organization, even within like a friends group, has varying levels of privilege that can be leveraged, and also varying levels of, like, I guess, risk that makes them more or less of a target to the state. So I'll kind of go into what that means. But essentially, um, the one thing it helps to keep in mind is anything really effective that's genuinely supposed to disrupt the status quo in any manner is not probably going to be something that's going to be signed off by authority. And therefore, with that comes a whole bunch of ever-present risks that are constantly present, like not situational risks, and then situational risks like cops showing up and things that are just happening all the time, basically to suppress activism. And I think it helps to understand that nothing we ever really do, if it's meaningful, if it's really rocking the boat, is safe, quote unquote, and never to presume that it is safe. And that there's always a level of risk. Therefore, you can go in with some amount of risk assessment and sort of protect your community that way. And like I said, level of risk varies by identity, and I think this is where sort of the layer of identity politics does come in, to where different folks, depending on their access to resources, can have a little bit more flexibility, essentially, with how much they can do and get away with, as opposed to other people that have way more at stake. And we'll kind of talk about leveraging that. So I guess the first thing is thinking about, if you are part of a group already that maybe is trying to build better infrastructure, we're going to share a couple of resources that have all of this like very systematically laid out. And I recommend reading that because we can't cover it in one session. But essentially, doing risk assessment and identifying your threats. And like briefly, like examples of threats are just different apparatuses, state apparatuses. So like law enforcement. And I guess we can like throw tips based on personal experience, but all of my experience with all of this comes from specific organizing around, I guess, probably one of the most quote unquote extreme issues to organize around in the United States, which is Palestine, which gets the most intense sort of surveillance and state blowback. So I guess I have maybe a little bit more experience with security culture than sometimes some other organizers that organize around other issues that are more acceptable. So there's even risk with issues. There's certain issues that are riskier than others. So law enforcement, obviously, and I know people think, I guess, before you go into the world of organizing, a lot of this sounds like it's just precaution that might be unfounded, and that it's all based on some like myth, but it is very real. And if you look into it, and once you actually experience it, you'll see how prevalent it is and common it is for law enforcement to, for example, investigate, charge, and falsely convict activists as a classic mechanism of like distraction, really. To distract groups and where their majority of their efforts and energies poured into, and honestly just scare activists into not doing what they're doing. So there is a consistent structure.
Yeah, so I'll plug right now at the bottom of the screen. We have our Discord. That's where all of the documentation that Aisha's mentioned is uploaded to our Twitch, or the Twitch channel rather of our Discord. So if you want to hop on over there, all that information is there that we'll be referring to.
Yep. And I will obviously, and the second half of this will just focus on protest safety, but I'm kind of giving this overview just because I didn't know a lot of this when I walked into the world of grassroots organizing, and it was scary, I think, at the beginning, realizing how powerful the forces that you're up against are, but then being aware of it, I think, makes you feel a lot more safer, knowing that you're not the only one doing this. This is not the first time this is being done. There have been, across movements, a lot of strategies that people have developed to be able to push back. And obviously government agencies, that's a huge thing. So this is sort of the ever-present threat that's not situational. So it doesn't just happen at a protest or at a particular initiative, but like surveillance of activists, that is both in-person surveillance. So for example, I'll like give anecdotes based on my own experience. So we've had, like, when we have annual conferences, when organizers are coming together to plan and strategize and think about how to structure our movements, we've like actually had to do checks for wiretaps because those are pretty common, and we've had that problem with in-person organizing. And outside of that, for example, a lot of activists that have some sort of electronic footprint. So if you have some like us, I guess, if you have podcasts, if you do something like that, then that can be used against you. So examples are, for example, it being pulled up by the TSA when folks are entering the country, and that's often sometimes been used to pull them aside and interrogate them based on their electronic footprint. Or in the process of getting jobs at certain corporations, if that's something you have to do. And then also, this is just, I guess, interesting to talk about because people are always shocked when I talk about it, but it's so common in the scope of Palestine organizing. But visits by like the FBI, by intelligence, intelligence agencies, unannounced visits. I had like 2 at-home visits where literally just like agents showed up from the FBI and Homeland Security and then just started asking me a bunch of questions. And ultimately, and it wasn't just me, so this is why it's helpful to organize in community, because initially when I got the sort of surveillance, and this goes to tactics to combat it, some of the approaches that we end up taking are very, very defensive and end up in kind of being counterproductive and falling right into the trap of what they want us to do, I guess, which is silence ourselves, organize in secret, be very gatekeepy about how we do our organizing, and spend so much energy being reactionary. And I guess initially maybe that is the defensive mode that a lot of people fall into. So I did try to like not post as much online, not be as open about my activism, and sort of take that route. And then talking to people more and being more open about what I was going through made me realize that so many people around the country are going through the same thing, and we just maybe don't talk about it to each other. And then that led me to resources like pro bono legal support, for example, which a lot of organizations around the country are willing to offer just if you were organizing around an issue, any kind of social justice issue. You just have to sort of like look up support. And I think then I took the opposite approach, which a lot of movements have taken to push back against surveillance and law enforcement violence in general, which is being extremely transparent and open about your movements and how you organize. And because we don't have anything to hide. So I basically went the other route, which is being very unfiltered about everything that I do and what I'm involved in. And then that way it's almost like turning the surveillance onto them, right? Because your activities are very transparent. So it makes it harder sometimes to be able to push back when everybody else is watching too. And this is an approach that people take even situationally, like in a protest. The bigger the protest is, the more transparent you are about who's organizing it, how it's being organized, and disseminating information. Again, the harder it is because it's not just police having eyes on you, then it's everybody. And there is more accountability to that. And I guess with that, we can kind of talk about the most common, I guess, tactic to push back is decentralization of all, any and all kinds. Essentially being able to decentralize your actual movement. So if you're in an organization, not having hierarchical structures where one person holds all the keys and holds all skills, resources, and making sure multiple people are able to function and do the same functions of the organization, or be able to respond to different threats. I think that's really helpful to really spend time building infrastructure. That's why we talk so much about having existing infrastructure. And decentralizing also like in real time. So if you're organizing a protest, for example, there's guides on how to structure the protest itself. And for example, have people that have a little bit more privilege up to the front and on the sides. So again, finding ways to mitigate risks based on leveraging the power that you do have and the privilege that you do have. And being open and transparent is part of that. Being very open about how you recruit and how the movement is, but also at the same time having security culture protocols. And that's why we talk about organizing in community, I guess, because communities that are strong and focusing on your relationships. So actually building relationships with the people that you organize with is super important, because that's basically how you filter through infiltrators. And again, that's another word which people are like, what? No, but yes, like it actually is very extremely common. And especially in abolitionist movements of any kind, or movements that are pushing back directly against the US like imperialism, where being in like really strong relationships with each other makes it very difficult for someone from the outside to just come in and hijack movements or cause disruption that's not intended. A simple example situationally is there's like intended placement of disruptors in protests sometimes to just randomly incite violence that doesn't make any sense. that totally distracts from like the aim of what the protest was supposed to be about, right? Like, and keeping an eye out for each other and structuring your initiatives around knowing each other and caring for each other makes that much harder to do. So I guess the most important thing is to start with risk assessment, thinking about not just an issue. X is a cop disruption that sometimes happens as that never helps. I don't think that ever that ever works out well. This is where I was going back to, sometimes it takes way more effort and is a distraction to be so reactionary to everything. So I think it's way better to start off with a solid foundation and like build infrastructure proactively. So say that, okay, we're going to build all these protocols to make sure that we're having relationships with each other. We have accountability mechanisms. We have mediation, conflict mediation, which is like one way to go through organizational issues, and think about, okay, make sure we're not a hierarchy, what kind of decision-making processes we're going to have, and do all of that proactively. So you don't just have to think about that when something happens. And, you know, it might just be interpersonal conflict sometimes, which can be worked through if you already have processes in place, as opposed to just like calling someone a cop, I guess. To be fair, I've been called a cop on Instagram by people that just think I'm a cop, because I actually think nation states are bad and not just America.
Yeah, so you brought up a couple points, and actually, it kind of works into what we've talked about in the past. This idea of building community, and the necessity to build meaningful community outside of the internet. And I think that's a really hard thing for a lot of people, not just because of COVID, but I think for younger generations, that's a little bit more inaccessible. And then trying to build that framework can be really difficult, and it's a slow process. And just to circle back to what you said earlier about, like, how do you engage, especially if you have a platform with any kind of protest or organizing in general,
Mm-hmm.
can be really challenging. And it's something that you definitely, either you once you can't be in the middle, you have to either go all in or not at all, uh,
Yeah.
in terms of
Yeah.
how you play that role.
Yeah, and I think the being in the middle will lead to essentially what I talked about, which is like, I think a lot of people are in the middle initially, right? Like, it is, as you yourself are like unplugging from all these systems, you might still be wrapped under like the fear of, what if I never, do this? What if this happens? What if that happens? And I think you just have to assess for yourself, how far are you willing to go, and is it worth it? And be very realistic about this. And because at the end of the day, the problem also is sometimes you have people that aren't willing to go all the way, and then those can be very disruptive to movements. And those are threats, essentially, because if you have, and this is very common, neoliberals enter like radical leftist movement spaces, and then when it's time to like go all out and do like a disruptive action or civil disobedience of any kind, then it's like, oh, but I'm not comfortable with this because it's not a legal protest. Well, of course it's not a legal protest. Like, most effective protests aren't legal protests. So then it becomes really hard for the people that have invested so much of their energy into building that movement to now spend so much time trying to appease all these people that are uncomfortable and are fragile and feel unsafe by the nature of opposing the state, which is
Yeah.
why I started off with, nothing about this is safe.
Yeah, and that's something I think we've historically seen. If you look at, like, even Black Lives Matter,
Yep.
movements get commodified and co-opted so quickly,
Yep.
and it's a very specific tactic to basically defang any actual meaningful protest.
Yeah, I guess like we need to start seeing this as a intentional tactic, because I know a lot of people sometimes think, oh, it just so happens, and then don't assign this like malicious intention to it. But it is very intentional for corporations to suddenly start using like BLM marketing and throw it on their products. And like, it is also like, for example, diversity and inclusion initiatives that happen at a lot of corporations and institutions. Those are literally just meant to distract you. It's literally just an appeasing tactic that's meant to take all of this probably well-intentioned energy that people come in with, wanting to genuinely change something and having all this hope, and take that and then take it into something that absolutely goes nowhere. And by the time you get to the end and you realize, oh shit, nothing's going to happen, then you're already really tired and burnt out. And then that cycle just sort of continues. So all of these structures in terms of state repression and institutional repression exist to exhaust you. So security culture is also mitigating how exhausted you are by not misdirecting your efforts on things that don't matter. And I think like constantly being distrustful of each other and that stuff like that sometimes is part of that distraction. right? Like, and I think that's why starting off with a stronger community structure is way safer. But I think something you pointed out for Gen Zers, I talk this all the time because I think like maybe we lucked out, and by we I mean like millennials lucked out that all of my organizing experience, all of my political radicalization happened in community, in person, in like real life. And then COVID happened, and then I was like, okay, well, like I want to like do something with this, and then it was just a result of that. But I obviously learn a lot online, but I think the biggest like shifts happened in community, and it also prevented me from being like really shitty to people, because I think that's so much easier to do online. So I never really had that like villain arc where I'm just like fuck you, like canceling people, because it was just so much harder to do that when someone in front of you who who you care about has a different viewpoint, is telling you something that like triggers cognitive dissonance, but I can't just like spit in their face and run. I have to sit there and be like, okay, I'm gonna like, and it actually was the reason I like grew at all, because so many people forced me to feel uncomfortable about things I was doing. And then it was sort of this like beautiful accountability mechanism, I guess. But now accountability is all about like yelling at people online. So it's unfortunate, but that's why I think learning about digital security is super important for anybody who does any sort of online work at all, political work. And in one of the resources that we'll share on the Discord server, there's a security handbook, but it also has a digital security culture handbook, because real life security culture and digital security culture are like two whole worlds. And so digital security culture, for example, is ways that you can secure your communications with each other. So if you're talking about organizing events and strategies and initiatives, then making sure you do it on a platform that's encrypted and safer, like Signal, versus just like I'm messaging each other. Or for example, if you go to a college campus or are at an institution and have an institutional email, like at your university.edu or at google. whatever, like an actual company email, it's like really not advisable to use those to plan political stuff, because legally they're allowed to basically pull the servers and ask for any and all emails at all, even if it's deleted. It's not actually deleted, it just goes and it's just stored permanently in a server. So freedom of information requests can be made, and you have to basically reveal everything. So I guess digital security, that is about how can you secure where you store things, how you store things, how you communicate with each other, email and phone and laptop, and thinking about how we can protect each other, even though the sad thing is, we've talked about this before, we don't have a lot of decentralized systems and platforms to even do this work on. Because ironically, like doing activism on Instagram is, as we've seen with many leftist accounts that have been like shadow banned or deleted entirely, the big digital security issue is someone can just like delete your account like this and erase like institutional memory of, if you store something on the cloud, for example. That's actually pretty dangerous. So
I got my hard drives that everyone's just like, why do you have these? I'm like, just trust me on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I guess ultimately the safest thing still is like pen and paper now, going back to that. But yeah, so there's digital security I highly recommend for people that do most of their work online. Well, don't. I really recommend going outside and talking to people. But also, if you do it anyways, then making sure you're doing it in a secure manner. Yeah, and going back to risk assessment, I guess like it's a spectrum. There's nothing is like a binary of high risk, low risk, but you can kind of roughly look at it somewhere near higher or lower risk. So for example, folks that are like people of color, poor, marginalized people tend to be higher risks. And we're talking about risk in relation to like, how likely are they to be targets of the state? So for example, if you go to a protest, a literal protest where there's police, it's smarter to always have people that are white passing to be at the front and on the sides, because they will less likely face intense violence and physical altercations with the police. So the purpose of this is to evaluate your risk and then know when and how to place things, to be able to use the privilege of your most privileged members to sort of protect the more vulnerable at-risk folks. And for example, access to resources. Certain folks are poor, and if there's consequences, like if you get arrested at a protest, then a lot of times to be able to bail you out. And there's folks that have a little bit more access to wealth, and to them, being arrested is actually not that big of a risk. They can afford to do that, and they will be bailed out. So being strategic about that, because you have to accept if you're going to do this or not, there's going to be a risk involved, but you can actually control how that happens. Or for example, even the nature of what you're doing. So if you do something online, or like a legal rally, that's way less risk than getting into property destruction, right? Which is higher risk and often necessary. But and then also just how politically active you are. I think if you are an organizer, obviously, but also if you're very outspoken about certain issues, then there's a higher target on your back and a larger electronic footprint, as opposed to people that show up at a protest because it's happening, but again, if folks are doing that and organizing is not at the forefront of your world, then you might actually be a better asset by being able to put yourself out there more in in-person events, where it's less of a risk for you to be able to interact with law enforcement, for example. But thinking about, I think the one thing I want to mention before I go into protest stuff is knowing your local community really well and understanding your local context. Because depending on where you live, there's a deep history with how the law enforcement has interacted with activists in that area. And that also shapes your risk. Because, for example, if you live in, I don't know, like Los Angeles or SoCal, there's a pretty intense, like, any sort of anti-Zionist like activism is just like super suppressed, and there's like power dynamics involved often that people don't even realize, where they lose jobs, they get kicked out of university campuses, and there's all these players and actors that show us how powerful that particular dynamic is. So I think being aware of that sometimes allows you to shape your events and know accordingly. For example, you might decide to be a little bit more secure about how open your organization is or your group is in terms of like how easily you recruit people. You might want to have a little bit more filter. For example, we do for like Palestine solidarity groups. And it's not gatekeeping, but just expect people to know people and just have someone to vouch for you, essentially. Where if it is an intense issue like that, then, for example, like you go at a protest, it's pretty common for police to always arrest people. There's cities where that pretty regularly always happens, right? Like Chicago, for example. Or if it's pretty common for, again, disruptors to show up and like start shit and have infiltrators. So you can kind of like adapt, I guess, according to that. And then the last thing I'll say is like know your rights stuff. This is like, again, very accessible online. There's groups that will come to your org and give you free workshops on it, but there's whole like pamphlets that give you like an abbreviated version of all the rights that you have in terms of what you can and can't do, what you can and can't say, and also like what happens when you do interact with law enforcement or like intelligence agencies, and what power you do have and what access to resources you have. And I think knowing that is really important because, for example, when I got interrogated, I'm not actually, the first time at least, I like said way more than I should have said. And not because I have anything to hide, but because I just don't want to fucking talk to these people and I don't have to. And I should have just asked if they had a warrant or a subpoena of any kind, and then no, then get out. You'll hear from my lawyers. But out of the fear and the intimidation, which is like what they're designed to do, I said a lot more than I should have said. And, a lot of times knowing how you can protect your communities is just knowing like when to not do shit, I guess.
Yeah. So I would add an asterisk to what you're saying in terms of the organizations. The United States, as far as I know, has much more resources available in terms of those workshops that you're talking about. I mean, I it could be because I'm in the U.S., but as far as I'm aware, it's not as common in other parts of the world to have those resources available for workshops and things like that. And if I'm wrong, please let me know in the chats. But that's at least from conversations I've had.
Yeah, I think it's just there are more resources like online, like again, like little abbreviated, pamphlets and things like that. But yeah, I think folks are lucky if you're organizing. I mean, lucky and unlucky to be like in the beast of the empire to like organize in the United States, I guess. But also on the other hand, I would say like most other communities outside the like outside colonial countries tend to be more collectivist, so they just end up having stronger community infrastructure, which sometimes just in the US we really struggle with because we have to fight through all this like capitalism and individualism that we're just like ingrained with. So it's interesting, I guess, seeing the dynamic play out. Yeah. So okay, moving into protests, one of the resources that will be shared on the Discord is there's like a bunch of PDFs you can download by a group called Riot Medicine that basically gives you everything that you possibly need to know about emergency medicine stuff that you can do in person at a protest or an event in case of a medical emergency. There's a whole textbook if you're actually like interested in serving as a medic and being someone at protests who can take on that responsibility. And then there's also like an abbreviated version for folks that are in the field that just need to know, organizers that just need to know what they can do when the time comes. But I think the most important thing is to always prepare, plan, and come with resources, because like I said, it's always best to assume nothing is safe. And that includes quote unquote legal rallies. I think we saw that with like the last wave we had of police murders, that there were so many protests that were met with a lot of violence and arrests. And these are legal protests with like where organizers got licenses and whatnot, but from the city, and it still happens. So that's not necessarily a safety blanket.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, we did 2 weeks ago, I think it was, an IFAC and basically a mini Stop the Bleed on here. So for folks that are listening and say, "Oh yeah, I should probably learn that stuff," you can go through our database of episodes, I guess you could call them, on our YouTube. Twitch, I know, is a pain in the ass about this stuff. So like you can only like see it for I think a day or two unless you subscribe, which costs like a couple bucks, which if you want to, great. But also we put it up on YouTube. We've also started uploading all of the episodes as audio files on a alternative podcast called the Poor Proles Skillshare, I think it's called. So for folks that are like, I can't sit still and watch something for that long, like you can go and just listen to it there. So this is like a perfect episode for that because there's not a lot of visual stuff going on. But yeah, so if you are thinking about like, okay, basic medical security, go watch the How to Build an IFAC and what should be in it. Fairly simple, fairly cheap. And it's something that everyone should have on them because the idea is that your IFAC is for you, not for the people around you. So if everyone has one, even if something major happens, there's enough. So if you're concerned about the people around you, make sure yourself is taken care of first. So just something to think about.
Yeah, I was gonna say the first thing that I had written down is like that essentially, and even scaling down to like having basic first aid kits. Again, not for everybody else, but like making sure you have enough for you. And there's you literally can like Google search this about what are the essentials that you need for a first aid kit that involves any sort of a group or a community protest. And making sure you have things that you might not anticipate, but are still like things that you can easily use in worst case scenarios, I think helps. And this is where like workshops like that help prepare for worst case scenarios, because some certain resources that you can have like gauze or Band-Aid is like, it's simple, but sometimes can help even in worst case scenarios. And thinking of, for example, we always talk about stuff that you should show up with. So beside first aid kits, it's also things like that might be necessary, not just for short-term injuries, but in case arrests happen, for example, and you're not able to return home safely for more than 24, 48 hours or even longer, then having access to medications, for example, enough supply of daily medications that you need, insulin, EpiPens, and pain relieving medication. These are like simple things that kind of plan for worst case scenarios where, okay, this goes really wrong and I get arrested. So something like that happens. And also thinking about having what we call like a medical card. And this is kind of a fine line between, I guess, being identified and then making sure that you're trying to protect your identity as much as possible, but then also having information that's necessary for emergencies, like things that you're allergic to, medical conditions that you have. And by allergic to, I mean, for example, if you have like a penicillin allergy and then something happens and you're taken to the hospital, it really helps to know that. So any kind of medical information that would be essential if you are taken to the ER is something to think about and have on a little card that's on you at all times. I think that always helps. And most importantly, I think if you're planning an event, thinking about bringing medics with you. There are tons of if you Google an organization in your area that will volunteer their time to come and serve as medics at events, especially I think after the wave of protests that has happened within the last 2 years. There's organizations that actually do this and paramedics that will show up. But then also you can train folks in your organization quite a bit. So for example, BLS training, which is basic life support, is accessible to people, to anybody. So you can actually get certified and get the training. And it's pretty accessible, at least to folks in the United States. And I think having at least core organizers of protests do this training pretty much gives you a lot of information that you need to just at least do harm reduction when something happens. Ultimately the idea is to evacuate and get help if something happens that's extreme, but harm reduction, I think, is kind of the approach that you can take in this case. And also, if you're thinking about, like I said, protest structure is important. This is where it's about mitigation of violence as much as possible, in terms of like protecting your people and making sure you're structuring your protest to where folks with privilege are at the front and folks with less privilege or more medical conditions or with chronic illnesses or disabilities are just a little bit more insulated towards the inside. And then besides BLS, another thing I thought of is de-escalation training, which is, again, way more accessible to people in the United States for free, essentially. There's already like workshops and stuff on YouTube and de-escalation training specifically is if there is a hostile interaction that happens, if you have some sort of a violent disruption that wasn't even planned, how do you actually go about that? And making sure, for example, you have people that are assigned to be liaisons if the event comes that you need to interact with the police. And making sure who is it and how equipped are they and how protected are they to be able to have that interaction. So I think planning for things like that beforehand is another part of making sure that when it really comes down to it, you do need to take care of each other, and then there's a responsibility for you to like mitigate violence as much as possible. And in general, I think we can go through you can throw out like general tips if I'm forgetting anything, but so we always think about the biggest thing that you think about are like physical violence, so like being beat by batons and like literal physical altercations, but more often than not it's chemical exposure, like tear gas and pepper spray and other chemicals that are pretty widely disseminated. So in cases of that, you can actually do a lot by preparing for it, and doing a lot of preventative measures that can basically, it's pretty consistent that this happens. I think most mass protests that I've seen, it's pretty regular now, at least the use of tear gas. So just preparing for it. So things like, for example, now it's more normalized to have N95s, but if you ideally have a gas mask, but if not, N95s actually go a long way in protecting against chemical exposure, and also like swimming goggles. So anything that's resistant to breaking, but also can protect your eyes when the time comes. And little things I think that help are the most you can do, I guess, is minimize the amount of your body that's exposed in any way possible. So that basically means covering as much as possible, long sleeves, closed-toed shoes, pants, but also layers. And the reason we talk about layers is because there's increasing use of rubber bullets now, which can, and I mean, if there's impact to your head or your eye or anywhere in your face, then that can be a lot more severe. But usually with body, it's tough. There will be bleeding. There will be like breaking of skin. There will be bruising. But if the more layers you have, the less of an impact there is. So preparing and anticipating that. And also thinking about, for example, not putting any oil-based like moisturizers or creams, or even sunscreens, like putting sunscreen, but there's non-oil-based sunscreens. And the reason that is because they actually clog up a bunch of chemicals. So for example, if you are exposed to pepper spray or tear gas, it will actually stick to your skin and be an irritant. And also contact.
And I was gonna just say, you talked about like the layering, and specifically, wearing black. Typically you hear the term like black bloc, and it's literally because you want to wear all black and not be able to be differentiated.
Yes. And now I guess it's normalized because of the frequent use of masks, but trying as much as possible to have like facial coverage as well, which can go a long way in protecting, not just for the purposes of like chemical protection is important, but also de-identification. There are facial recognition technologies that are pretty widely used now, especially if it's a large protest in a major urban city, and you can go a long way with just covering your nose and your mouth.
Yeah, and speaking of the technology component, like that also plays into your own digital footprint and keeping yourself secure and separate from your cell phone for an extended period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So if
Yeah,
you're going to be
and I
going to
think a lot of people suggest even like paper and pen for like literal analog ways that you can record what's happening at a protest, because it is important to document like instances of police brutality, for example, to be able to be a witness to something. But besides having like cameras and phones and such, like sometimes literally being able to document, have witnesses, have people that can vouch for you.
Yeah, and if you are gonna bring a phone, to bring basically a burner phone. You can get like track phones for like $30, $20. They're fine. They're sufficient for the purposes that you might need them to
Yeah.
contact certain people. But the key thing is to insulate yourself at the protest from the rest of your identity as much as you can. Anything that might be able to be incriminated against you, to just be smart about it.
Hmm. And another thing I was thinking of is if and not wearing anything that can be tugged on or pulled. So, like if you have long hair, tie it, put it in your hoodie. Jewelry, loose clothing that's very easy to be pulled, because that's another thing. Like, if cops show up, they often show up not just with like battalions, but on horses and shit, which is wild. But like they do grab people and like use any and all things to be able to tug on you. So yeah, being able to be insulated as much as possible, I think, is sort of a protective mechanism. But also another protective mechanism is making sure you're not there alone, and you're just using a buddy system. And usually, if organizers are putting folks together, then you should always have people that keep tabs of each other to make sure that when big things happen, that at least people are keeping an eye out, keeping track of like who's where. And if folks are not traceable, then making sure then there's like search parties that can be put out to like make sure someone's safe and okay. Um, Again, those are like pretty classic preventative measures. And oddly, yes, I think tear gas is pretty common, but the most frequent thing that I've seen at protests in terms of like a health hazard is like heat stroke, heat stroke and exhaustion. That's like the most common thing I've seen. Like that's pretty severe sometimes for folks, and therefore just making sure that you have enough water and basic like food supply, like granola bars or anything that you can eat if something happens, but especially water. Like having as many bottles of water as possible is like, hydration is so important, especially if this is something that's happening under like direct sunlight, which can be extremely extremely draining for certain people. And I think people don't even realize what a heat stroke is until it just happens to you.
Yeah, basically. And it could be, yeah, it's one of those things. We're in a weird time right now where we've had these protests, and I think about like, and you might have similar experiences to me when I was in college and after college, and in more active in a lot of this stuff. Like I didn't have texting, so like if you wanted to get a hold of somebody, like there was only a few channels to do that.
Hmm.
And also like thinking around like organizing in general, and like the protest community. um, we here in the United States, it's grown so much, and it's so much better, and like I hesitate to use the phrase, but like battle hardened compared to even where we were like a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and I
um,
guess I guess that comes from there. And outside the United States, certain communities are consistently like normalized to this. Like for example, like Palestinians on the ground, right? Like I think this is just their life. But I think in the U.S. over the last like few years, there's been an arc of people becoming increasingly politicized and normalized to this. Maybe because it is like a balance of like increasing technology. I guess it's made it apparent to people how people are treated at protests and what really happens. Whereas before, a lot of the surveillance and a lot of the intense like backlash people would face was very shielded and shielded within communities and people just knowing what happened, because there's no news coverage. There was no news coverage, but now there's like at least the media is not just the sole distributor of information, I guess, which is a little more. But also, protests are larger because of the co-optation. So there's a bunch of randos that show up to protest, to take pictures and post about it. So there is. It's like everything is this.
yeah, it's interesting, it's different.
Yeah,
uh
it's very different how normal it is to be like, oh yeah, you guys, let's go to a protest.
yeah. Yeah, was there anything else you wanted to talk about in regards to
Um,
protest security?
Oh yeah, so I think the other thing is I wanted to cover a little bit about tear gas and then wounds, like actual wounds. So with tear gas, I think people have pretty much heard this, but I mean, try not to wear contacts. If you wear glasses, just wear glasses and wear goggles over it. But don't wear contacts as much as possible, because a lot can go wrong with contacts. But thinking about, again, bringing water as much as possible, because that just not just for hydration, but for also flushing your eyes out, for rinsing your mouth and spitting, not swallowing, and blowing your nose. For all of those purposes, it really helps. And I know there's like debates between like, oh, should we use milk? Should we use that? I think in general, like water is safe, like flushing your eyes with water. And if you do have access to it, which you can get at any like over the counter store, half antacid and half water, which is like, and by antacid specifically like aluminum hydroxide or magnesium hydroxide and half water. That tends to like get rid of things fairly quickly. And also things to, speaking of things to take, taking a change of clothes. I think for me, I've actually had to use that where like the easiest thing to just like get rid of was just to get rid of everything and then just wear something different, which just prevented like long-term irritation. When it comes to wounds, a lot of like for example, like I don't know, I've had my ass beat at a protest. I didn't necessarily need to go to the ER, like, but I think it helped to have like ways to just take care of the situation in the moment. So if there's like minor cuts and for example bruises, with cuts, for example, the biggest issue is infection and the risk of infection. So anything and everything that you can do to mitigate that, which is just making sure you carry medical grade alcohol with you all the time, that can go a long way. So making sure you can sanitize your hands and then have someone who can use sanitized hands to be able to wash the wound out with water and basically put bandage over it to close it and to prevent it from having any sort of external exposure. And another thing that first aid kits tend to have, but if not, you can actually go get it, is antibiotic ointment. So it's like Neosporin. You can actually get this over the counter. Again, just to put that on a cut or a bruise or a wound. Sometimes you don't really know where you got cut on. Oftentimes it's metal, and that's where there's a higher risk if you do cut yourself on metal. And I think if there's inflammation, so sometimes if you're just getting like beat with a baton, then you're probably having a swollen arm or a swollen leg. That's where like pain relievers helps because they actually help with inflammation. Chances are you're not going to be able to really carry ice around, but if you can go get ice, then yes. But if not, then pain relievers actually help a lot. Would just, I guess, keep you in not pain for long enough to be able to get you out of there, which is the goal. And with larger injuries in general, you cannot fix the problem there. I think that's important. It is not your job. It is not your responsibility. If someone's shoulder dislocates, please don't pop it back in. Like if you don't know how to do that. The most you can do as a rule of thumb for any major injury, whether it's a bleed or a cranial wound or like a dislocation, is stabilize it as much as possible. So what that means is if you have a splint, apply a splint to immobilize it. So prevent the person from moving as much as possible. If there is bleeding involved, you can apply pressure. Like if you have bandages, you can use that to be able to mitigate the amount of bleeding. And ultimately, it's psychological consolation to the person that's there to try to make sure they themselves are in shock and being able to address that till you're able to evacuate and call medics to be able to get real help.
Yeah, and I'll just comment on that. Like most medics don't care like what you were doing. They're there to fix you and not to judge you. So like if there's like a fear of like, I'm protesting and like I'm afraid some chud is gonna show up as an EMT or something, like
Yeah.
that's not something that really happens. They're not like cops. They're
Yeah, I think distinguishing between that is helpful, which is why I say there are a lot of like medic organizations and stuff that will volunteer to go to protests, because I think that's maybe one of the unique, maybe like firefighters, maybe there is a unique niche there where they are really there to protect us sometimes.
yeah.
So, but it helps for you. Your goal is to just be safe and get out of there and get help. So as far as that, there are very many layers of protection involved that allow them to do their job and for you to be safe there.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think this was like a pretty good overview for a lot of folks that like I think a lot of what we've talked about, not a lot, like 50% is stuff that people have heard before. But I think sometimes you need to like put it in a bigger package that like it frames it up in a digestible way that like each of the pieces of information kind of reinforce the other one, which is kind of what my hope was with this. So yeah,
Really,
is
the
there any?
lesson is like prepare, and don't underestimate the time it takes for you to like. It is helpful to have life skills in general, and I think like BLS is, for example, like a really great life skill to have. De-escalation is like a really good life skill to have to just protect not just yourself, but to protect other people around you. So I think like doing that kind of work on your own and for your community members and encouraging other people around you to do that is something that you can just like have with you forever.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of resources out there, like one day classes that you can learn like a lot from. I mean, on top of stuff that's on YouTube. But at the end of the day, a lot of this, I think you need, just like with community, you need that hands-on component. This is just
You
like
just
that
need to
curse.
show up to a protest, get tear gas, get beat, and
Yeah.
then you'll like learn.
Yeah, like you need to want to rip your eyes out of their sockets to really appreciate this stuff. And then you'll get it. Um, yeah, anything else? Folks that are watching, any questions, thoughts, concerns, complaints, reservations, addendums, anything? That was
Just,
my like shtick at the end of when I used to teach, like at the end of
oh,
a
cool.
lesson.
Yeah, everyone
Yeah.
has a spiel. That reminds me of like Robert's rules, like, yeah, addendums.
Yeah. Make it sound fancy. So yeah, I guess no questions really. Yeah, I thought this was really interesting. It's a, I won't ask too much. But like I'm in the Northeast and I know you've been kind of everywhere else. So it's interesting to hear the same like experiences. Like not that you would expect it to be significantly different, but I don't know, it's validating.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I kind of now looking back and more. Oh, another thing when I was thinking about digital security is like another common tactic that's pretty prevalent now in certain movements like abolition, like police prison abolition in Palestine, at least that I know of, is blacklists are pretty common for activists. So, for example, there's a website that puts anybody who does advocacy around Palestine in the United States or like UK, Australia, Canada onto a list where we're just called like anti-Semites, and there's just like everything about you that they can find is up there, including where you live, your phone number, what you do. Like they're basically literally tracking you in real time, and giving people updates about what your life is up to, and then spinning something and everything that you do into something that's like scary and malicious to try to frame it as like terrorism, essentially.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because part of, I guess, the pushback on that has been, yes, raising awareness about how ridiculous it is, but also people still doing what they're doing anyways.
Yeah.
And delegitimizing the like how like because it is very clownish to have something like this out there.
Yeah. Someone asked if there are a specific good resource available online for de-escalation.
Online, yeah, I want to say that there's let me actually like pull up. Yeah, we have I had certain orgs that I know that actually have like similar pamphlets that they put together for de-escalation. I can send it your way to throw on the Discord.
Yeah, will do. Yeah, so if folks listening enjoyed this conversation, please go check out Aisha's Substack. I know that's a new project for her, and I definitely will be checking it out as well. I already made a stirring posting one of your store reels or whatever it's called
Oh fuck.
uh, about yeah. So yeah, it's good stuff. It's interesting. It's definitely going to get your attention. So go check it out. Um, if you enjoyed this and you just want to throw her a couple bucks, I'm gonna post her Cash App and her PayPal so you can throw her a few bucks. And if you're not following her on Instagram, I don't know how you've made it this long following Corporal's Almanac and haven't started following her. It's at Woke Scientist. Yeah, I think that's just about it for us. Anything else you wanted to add?
No, yeah, thanks, y'all. Thanks, I guess, for having me again as a repeat cast.
You're gonna be like our weekly, bi-weekly repeat guest. You're just stuck
Yeah,
with
it's
me
like
now.
you have when you're like, oh well, let's bring her back on. We always
Yeah.
have something to talk about.
Yeah, there's always something to talk about. All I have to do is like be like, remember back in the day, and then we'll just talk about like
Yeah.
pre-Zoomer time, and we're good. We'll find stuff to talk about. For folks that are watching and they're like, "What the hell am I watching?" We are the Poor Proles Almanac. We have a podcast. We drop weekly episodes. You can check that out wherever you listen to podcasts. We recently did an interview with Dr. Sophie Chow over at the University of Sydney about Dayak resistance and gastrocolonialism, which is as interesting as you might think it is because you've probably never heard the term. Next week, we're doing an episode on Adena agriculture here in the United States about some indigenous land management practices. So definitely tune in for that next Sunday. And I will also do a quick plug for my other podcast called Tomorrow Today, where I speak with academics about the research that they're doing and make it meaningful for what the future looks like. So that's pretty much my plug. If you've enjoyed this, hit us up on subscribe, I think is the term on Twitch. I don't know. Whatever it is, I think you get like an Amazon Prime free subscription. So if you want to give us
Oh,
$2
cool.
and have it cost you nothing, go do that. If you want to support us on Patreon, $2, 7 cents a day, you get early access to all of our episodes and some other content that we didn't think people would really care about outside of like diehard listeners, I guess. So you can go check that out too. And I think that's just about it. So, Aisha, thank you so much for coming on. This has been great. And I look forward to seeing what else you come out with on Substack.
Thanks, y'all.